So law journeys are inspirational stories about motivation, resilience, and success. And today I have the distinct privilege of getting a chance to talk with Paige Samblanet, who's going to share her journey and talk about her unique experiences. And I hope it helps all of you. So Paige, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I want to get into your story and your journey, but let's start with where you are now. Obviously, it looks like you're in a firm office, so maybe you could talk about what your current position is and what you're doing, and then we'll take a look at your journey.
Yeah, so that was nice seeing the background. I am in my firm office. I do still have decorations over here, so I apologize if you see them.
It's okay.
And so I am at a firm. I'm at Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck, and we have offices across the US. We're headquartered in Denver, but I am in the LA office and I am a natural resources associate in our natural resources department. And I do a little bit of everything from contaminated properties to water quality, water rights, California Environmental Quality Act work, which is like land use work, a little bit of air work, and renewables, which is really fun. And yeah, I'm also on the associate pro bono committee here, which is really fun and allows me to do projects that I wouldn't typically do in the natural resources group. And I'm also a part of our political associate rotation program, our PAR program. So Brownstein is also the largest lobbying firm in the nation. And so we have a very big presence in DC. And I get to basically split my time between being an associate and also helping our policy and government relations folks.
Sounds like you've got a lot going on, and there's really an environmental theme, obviously, running through all of it. I want to get into the journey and how you got there, but I also happen to know that you have some involvement in the legal field outside of the work you do in terms of, organizations and groups. I wonder if you could just share that with us. I want to make sure I don't forget to include it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I currently am officially a part of the California Lawyers Association Environmental Law Section Executive Committee. So this past 3 years, I had been the liaison between the new lawyers section for CLA and the environmental law section. And so my term officially ends in September, and then I'm a part of the executive committee. So we hold a bunch of webinars, programs, get-togethers, just for environmental law students and practicing attorneys and judges at times, actually, to go over some specific environmental review processes. And so that's really cool. It's an incredible organization for anybody who's looking to be involved. Generally, CLA has numerous different sections, not just environmental law sections. So, yeah.
And Paige, just so everyone knows, because there's a lot you've already done in, I know it's a short period of time, but how many years have you been practicing?
So this is my 4th year of practice somehow.
So let's take a step back then, a pretty big step back, and really, maybe at a high level, talk about, your journey to this point, and how you got there. And so let's talk about your early influences. Was there a moment, a period in your life when you decided, yes, I'm going to be a lawyer, and, maybe you can help us understand how the environmental part of that came in?
Yeah. So I always knew I wanted to do something with the environment. I just didn't think it was law related. So from very early on, I knew that I wanted to do either I wanted to be a scientist or I wanted to be a biologist, engineer, or I guess an attorney. And so I originally thought I was going to be a scientist. That was my career route. And then I think what actually was the change, the switch that made me want to do law was I always was interested. My minor was in natural resource law and policy in undergrad. So I did have that interest always. But I think it was around 2015, 2016 when the Flint water crisis really started picking up in national news. And I think I read an article and it was talking about the ACLU and NRDC, which is Natural Resources Defense Council, and they were essentially suing the city and the state in representing all of these families in Flint that were impacted by this water. And so I found that fascinating and just loved that you can have an impact on environmental issues while also representing people. And that's really that environmental justice aspect that I love and that I'm really passionate about. And so I think from then, because I entered law school in 2017, so I had to be very recently, right after that, I was like, okay, I think I'm going to switch and try to become an attorney.
It's interesting, Paige, because a lot of people I've talked to, especially people who are pre-law, college students, high school students, they think everyone who goes to law school knew they were going to be a lawyer, right? Every
Yeah.
lawyer already knew they were going to be a lawyer from very early on. And so I think it's really important to share, your story, that you had an interest in it with science, and it was something that occurred in your life you were aware of, and then you not only pivoted to thinking about law, but you found a way to marry your passion for environmental issues and science with this idea of environmental justice. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, very fair. I definitely didn't think I was going to be a lawyer. So that switched very quickly. And I also think just working in the science fields, I loved what I did, and it was wonderful experience. And I use it every single day here too, which is very interesting. But I realized that that wasn't the route that I necessarily wanted to go on. And I think the biggest piece of advice, I guess, that, or something that I learned from that experience, was that you're not always stuck in the career that you choose, which is refreshing, because sometimes, especially as undergrad students, or even, if you pick some type of profession and you go to law school, let's say, you're not stuck. You can always switch careers, you can always use those skills in other areas. And I think that was really refreshing to know.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also really an important lesson for folks to have in mind, because it may not seem as dramatic as going from science to law to people, but again, there's a through line for you, which is that you're still drawing on your science background and using it in your legal career. But even broader, you don't have to. You can make a bigger switch. But I want to take another step back, and I think I know the answer based on what you said, which is that you really didn't start thinking about law too much as a profession until you had this experience of thinking about what was going on in Flint, Michigan.
Mhm.
But were there lawyers in your family? Were there lawyers in your immediate circle? Was the law something you were exposed to? And maybe along those lines, it would be a good opportunity to talk about your family's education and work experience and sort of growing up and what that was like.
Yeah. So growing up, I did not have any lawyers in my family. I wasn't really exposed to a practicing attorney until a few years after I was an undergrad. Um, at least in my family, my mom got married and his brother was an attorney. So that was really like the only experience that I had with any practicing attorneys. I knew that he worked a lot. I didn't know exactly what he did. And that was pretty much the extent of that for a while, until I ended up moving to Los Angeles, not for law school, but I was transferred internally from my engineering firm from Boston to San Diego. And so I ended up being very close with my that side of the family, and really learned what he did, and he loves it and was passionate about it. And I think that also helped to play a role in kind of realizing that this was a career that I could actually pursue, because growing up, I grew up with my mom and my grandma and the rest of my siblings, and there we really didn't have that exposure to anybody in really a lot of professional areas. So my mom had various jobs growing up when I was growing up, and was primarily a stay-at-home mom in a sense. And then my grandmother is a housekeeper for two doctors. So I had exposure to at least some degree in the medical field. But yeah, we really didn't have that much exposure to kind of the legal field at all.
You're obviously not alone in that, right? Like a lot of
Yeah.
folks coming up, don't have that. Certainly there's some that do, but one of the things that among many that I think is special about your journey is you still found your way, even though for a significant period of time you didn't have that connection. And obviously then you had a connection that gave you some exposure to law. Outside of law and outside of your immediate family, were there role models? Were there mentors? Were there people who you look back and say, yeah, this person made a difference for me early on? I'm talking about, growing up, maybe pre-college or even into college.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that as far as the legal field, no, right? I don't think I had any mentors or anybody who was like, you could be an attorney. There was jokes, obviously. They're like, oh, you're a good arguer. You could definitely be an attorney, right? But nobody to the extent of really pursuing a career. But I do think as far as mentorship and kind of encouraging me to chase my dreams and not being afraid to push the limits of what I think I'm capable of. I think there are a lot of people who did that, especially my family. I think my family has always been very supportive of everything that I do. And it's nice, especially when your family doesn't come from that, right? And they still are very much supportive, even when you want to switch a 180 in careers and they kind of are questioning some of those decisions, but are fully supportive of it. And then I also think that I had a cheerleading coach in high school who was very encouraging of always pushing the limits, always chasing my dreams, and really kind of pushed me out of my comfort zone a lot in a way that made me grow and realize that, I can do so much more than I think that I can.
I'm glad you brought that up because cheerleading, like, other types of activities, whether it's athletic activity or, theater, dance, that does have a way of pushing you to achieve things you didn't know that you could achieve, or maybe you weren't confident enough that you could achieve. And were there other things that you did in your life, other moments where it reinforced your ability to rise to the challenge, to, overcome obstacles and to push yourself to, achieve what you wanted to achieve?
Yeah, so I think there are probably a few. I don't know if we'll get into this one later, but I'll hint at it in a second. But I think the first one that I can think of is actually related to cheerleading. So I cheered at Syracuse University in upstate New York, and every single year I tore something in my knee. And I think your freshman year when you come on and you made the team and you get to do all this stuff, you get to travel, and it's very new, right? You're a freshman in undergrad. It's always just new and exciting in general. I think that was one of my hardest obstacles to have to overcome because, you're alone for the first time. I'm from Ohio, so I was a little bit further away from home than I have ever been. And I think I had to try to overcome this obstacle on my own and still prove that I was essential to the team. Because once you get hurt, it's kind of like, well, can you continue to do this or do you quit? And I didn't quit any of the years. I actually was captain of the team and went to Final Four. And my senior year of college, I tore my meniscus, and they said that I would not be able to compete at nationals, which was, I think, 2 months later. And I was on that national floor and I competed and I had a huge knee brace on. But I think it just showed me that I can do so much more than what people tell me, but also what I think. When you have encouragement and you put your mind to it, I really think that we are so much bigger than we think we are. So that's probably the first one. I think the second one that I alluded to earlier, we will probably discuss, but I struggled a lot in law school. And there were a lot of times where I did not think that I was going to be able to make it or that I questioned the decision. And I think that having the people that supported me, encouraging me to continue on and telling me and reassuring me that I was in the place that I was meant to be really helped me to get over that obstacle, which was probably one of the bigger ones of my adult life, I think.
Paige, I really appreciate you sharing both of those stories. And you're right, we will, I think, get into the law one in a moment or two. I want to go back to the description you gave, which I think was really powerful, of your experience in college cheering. I happen to know a fair amount about you from your time in law school, but I didn't know that you competed in nationals, when you weren't expected to, and you were dealing with a torn meniscus. I just wonder if you could tell us, did you reflect back on those experiences at any point in time during law school? Because it seems to me that if you can overcome that, and a theme that I think is true for you, and it's true for really everybody who makes it through the way you have, is failures exist. We experience failures. We experience defeats, if you will. And the true test for us is being able to bounce back. Now, not everybody can compete 2 months after tearing a meniscus. I'm not suggesting that, but I wonder if you had any moments, whether it was in law school or at other times, when you actually did reflect back, like we just did, about, hey, you know what? I have done something that maybe I wasn't sure I could do, and certainly other people didn't think I could do, and that should give me confidence that, yes, I can do this next thing.
Yeah, so I do think that I've reflected on it a lot, especially recently. I think during law school, it's a little different, right? I think overcoming something physically is, in some instances, or at least in my experience, easier than overcoming something mentally that you really truly think you cannot do it, right? And I think in law school, even when I would reflect on, okay, look at how far you've come, which is always necessary, I think, when you're struggling, is to realize how far you've come. It's not just how much you have left to go, but I think that knowing that that was a physical challenge and something that I could work on, I could strengthen my knee every day. I knew that I could do that. It was proven, right? And I think that is different than going to school and really struggling and not understanding, no matter how hard you try, and then really just getting into that kind of loop of, I don't think I can do this.
I think that makes a lot of sense, right? The distinction between the physical and the mental. I again don't know that you give yourself enough credit always for what you've done. But let's, if we can, Paige, talk some now a little bit more about what law school was like, and especially leading up to it, right? So what was your expectation going into law school? You're coming from a science background, you were at Syracuse, but you're from Ohio, and then you go all the way across country for work to Southern California, and then you go to law school, obviously at Loyola in LA. And what was your expectation going in? Kind of take yourself back to what was that mindset, and kind of where you were at that time.
Yeah, so I think that my expectation was, everyone says that this is hard and I should expect it to be hard, but I've done hard things a lot of times in my life, and I think I can do this as well. I think in undergrad and in high school, I wasn't always the smartest, absolutely, but I tried really, really hard. And that has always been, I think, one of my strong suits is I just really, really try and work at things. And so I thought that this would be similar. I would try really, really hard, and I wouldn't always be the smartest, but I would get through it. And I think that also, coming from working, I had dealt with a lot of really hard problems from a scientific perspective. And I kind of assumed that that would somehow help me. And I actually think, we'll probably get into this, but I think it made it a little harder, actually, to think from a scientific perspective, or kind of use that way of thinking and reasoning, and not using the tools that I was given immediately. I eventually learned to kind of switch my brain off from being a scientist to being a lawyer. But I think initially I thought that if you put in the work, and if you think that you can do it, you can, which is true to an extent, absolutely. But I didn't anticipate struggling as much as I did. And I also didn't anticipate, I guess, the rigor that actually comes with law school, even though everyone tells you. I don't think you truly understand until you're in it.
Yeah, and that's fair. As a law professor, I have to acknowledge that, it is fair to potentially underestimate the rigor. Let's get into it now so I don't forget this idea of thinking through things in a sort of a scientific way versus a law school way. And maybe if you could just sort of summarize for us what that means to you, and then how you made the transition ultimately to thinking in a way that, I guess, proved more effective.
Yeah, so in a scientific reasoning, I guess, when you are looking at a problem, you are gathering all the facts, doing all the tests, getting your results, and then that is your conclusion. There are no if, ands, or buts. You may do it a few different times, but those are your conclusions. And that is how I approached everything in law school initially. I'm going to gather all the facts. I'm going to deduce them down to this one conclusion that I have, and that is it. That is not the law school way. And even it's different for different subject matter in law school, right? You may have one strategy for one thing and a different strategy for another subject. And so I think I've had to flip it on its head almost. Instead of gathering all the facts and then coming to a conclusion, it was, well, here is the conclusion I want, or here are the variety of choices I have. Let me find the facts that support these and see which one is strongest, or see if I can argue any or all of them. And so it was really interesting to have to make that, complete switch of thinking. And I think the way that I did it was honestly practicing and talking to professors. I think there's sometimes you feel like you should isolate in law school, and I actually don't think that is the correct way to do things, just from my perspective with my personality, right? There's different things that work for everyone. But I think for my personality, I had to talk through things. I had to understand why I was not understanding. And I think the only way that I could do that was talking to my professors and continually going through problems. I would literally go through problem sets and try to write out essays on my own, and then go to a professor and say, okay, would you think this way? Or how would you do this? What would you think going through this? And that's how I learned how to kind of switch that. And that's when I realized how different it was.
It's interesting, Paige. We talk a lot in law school about this. The most common answer is "it depends," right? That's, as professors, we say that. And I never thought about it until you just described it. But I imagine for someone who's more science oriented, who's used to having an answer, it may not be a good answer or maybe inconclusive, but it's not an "it depends." It could go either way. It depends who has the better of the argument on a given day. And so I really can see where that would be something that you have to wrestle with. And the way you described how you overcame that, I think, is really important, because whether you're a scientist or not is your background, that understanding of how you approach legal problems, I think, is pretty important.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I continue to remind myself every day. It's interesting now because I kind of do a little bit of both, right? Especially on certain contaminated property sites, I use a lot of what I learned as a scientist. And then I have to hurry up and switch my brain and say, okay, now that I have the results, let me go see how I can make this into an argument. So now I kind of use both, which is really interesting.
Yeah, but it's one of the things that you have, obviously, an advantage. I don't think it precludes people from pursuing environmental law if they don't have a science background. And maybe you can comment on that for people who are interested in being environmental lawyers. But I can see where it would really give you an advantage to be able to deal with the science and deal with the law. Whereas when I was practicing, we encountered topics that I wasn't familiar with. I had to consult an expert, someone who could help me with that. But on the science stuff, you already have some background. But can you talk a little bit about how that's both an advantage to you, and but then at the same time, how people can still pursue it even if they don't have that background?
Yeah, so it's definitely an advantage for what I do. So when people think of environmental law, typically you think, oh, this is a subset of the law, environmental law. there are so many subcategories of environmental law, and you could be an expert in one, and that could make your entire career. You would not have to touch any of the other realms. And I think that is also something that I learned in law school that I did not know until I kind of experienced it on my own. But I think for what I do, knowing how to translate numbers into an argument is very, very useful. And I think that is an advantage for me, and especially when I'm communicating with experts or consultants, because I used to be a consultant. So understanding that way of thinking, I think, is really beneficial, especially kind of being the translator between sometimes there's, someone who doesn't necessarily understand the science. But if you can communicate that effectively, it's very useful and it saves a lot of time. Now, it doesn't preclude anybody from practicing environmental law, and especially it depends on what you want to do in environmental law. I think the groundwork for a lot of what I do, or what I try to incorporate into each part of my practice, is a piece of some type of environmental justice piece, or even just the way I approach a problem versus how others approach a problem, just because I try to keep in mind that a lot of what I do and a lot of the effect that I have is because I'm usually the only one in the room that looks like me, right? And so I am the first person who is able to give an opinion about, if you build this here, you're going to impact these communities. And you may not have thought of it that way at first. And so let me explain that to you. And so I think you don't need a science background to be able to do that. Right. And I think that a lot of people who want to pursue environmental law have so many different opportunities. And you can learn the science, or you can talk to an expert. You don't have to know it, right? You just have to be passionate about it. And then all of the other things kind of fall into place.
You undoubtedly, Paige, knew going in that you were likely to be the one, or one of very few people who look like you, who have your background experience in those places, right? In the law firm, in those settings where you find yourself now. How did you, if you did, prepare yourself for that? How do you approach that, knowing that I imagine there's some challenges, right, that come with being the one, or one of very few? So can you share with us how you approach that initially, and then how you continue to fight the fight now?
Yeah, I think that initially, as a newer attorney, even now, I'm in my 4th year of practice, and I think there's also always a level of feeling intimidated, in my experience, self-doubt, me projecting onto others that, oh, they don't think I'm smart, or they don't think my opinion matters. And that's not necessarily true at all, really. People want you in the room because they want to hear your opinion, especially as their legal counsel. They, of course, want to hear your opinion. And so I think that initially the way that I approached that was, I didn't think I was going to go into a firm. I thought I was going to either go into government or a nonprofit. And when I made the decision to ultimately go into a firm, I kind of wanted to make sure that I didn't lose why I went into law, and to always kind of make a promise to myself that if given the opportunity, I will try to be a voice for others who aren't in the room. And now I think that also comes with challenges of, you're one person. There are so many different perspectives in a community, in all communities, right? It is not a monolith, and you don't want to represent it that way. But I think that being able to give a voice to people who aren't in the room is very powerful, and it seems intimidating. Absolutely. But I think that there's power in knowing that you have a community behind you, even if they're not there. So I think that's how I initially approached it. And I think how I approach it now is, I know that people want to hear my opinion. I know that it is valued, and I've seen it make a difference. So the example that I gave you about building something somewhere, I represent sometimes represent developers, or sometimes I'm suing them. It's really, I represent a bunch of different clients. But there have been instances where they're considering building something somewhere and they have not taken into account, oh, you're right, there are different impacts that could happen to different communities because we are building it here. What are our other options? And that is very powerful. And once you get that first win or somebody takes your advice that you think is really important, it just kind of, reassures you that you could keep making those suggestions and you can have a voice in the room.
It's so impactful what you're describing, because even as a relatively junior person in terms of your time as an attorney, you're able to share your thoughts. And you're right, the clients are, paying the bills to get your input. And I don't know that everyone is comfortable doing that, but I'm really glad that you're able to share with us how you did that. There's so much that I want to go into, but obviously, I got to kind of pick and choose where to follow up on. I want to go back to something you said earlier when you were talking about law school resources and strategies, because I think you already shared with us some important ones. So I want to make sure we don't lose sight of some that might be helpful. So you've talked with us about kind of how you approached studying, the transition you made, the importance of talking to professors and kind of getting feedback on what you're doing. Were there other sources of support, whether it was, colleagues or, classmates or other places that you found support and empowerment that helps you to, get through that law school part of the journey that you're on?
Yes. So I think there are multiple different resources that law students can use. I think it really depends on what works for each person. And I realized that I had a bunch of different things that worked for me, depending on how I was feeling, what the subject matter was, or what the situation was. So I think for some subjects, it was a lot easier for me to understand it on my own and to just go through problems and talk to a professor. And that was my strategy for some things. Other tools were using your fellow law students and, being able to talk through things with them, or just even sit there in silence, but, camaraderie around it. And I think that is very important. Like I said, I think I said this before, isolation for me, I thought it was going to be useful, and it ended up being very, very difficult because you get in your mind about, I'm not supposed to be here. And so I think kind of getting out of that and being with other students and knowing that there are people who are feeling the same thing, but you're looking at them and saying, you know everything. Well, how do you feel that way? And maybe that's what you are also doing, and you're kind of playing into that. And so I think that self-realization is really helpful to continue on. You were one of the best resources that I had and kept me in law school. So that is absolutely, you were the number one thing that kept me in law school. So thank you very much for that. I think that one of the other things that I did not talk about that you were very much involved in is SI. So Summer Institute, that prepared me for the unexpected, right? I think that was so, so, so useful because I really didn't know what to expect going into law school, and just to know the method of, this is what we're going to be experiencing in class. This is what a problem looks like. This is what a test will look like. This is what a case will look like and how you analyze it. That was so important, and I think so useful. And I think outside of those, also relying on the network you have outside of law school. So for me, it was family and friends, but sometimes they don't know what you're going through. It is a little difficult to communicate it because it kind of sounds like your world is ending every day, or, you're having a wonderful day one day and then the next day you don't know what you're doing. And so, it's kind of difficult for others to imagine, especially if they haven't gone through it. So I think relying on a network for me was the environmental law section for the California Lawyers Association. It was one of the things that helped me so much in realizing that, oh, I can absolutely see a career here. There are people who have gone through the same thing and now are working at the EPA, working for the president, changing the world. And that is so inspiring. And so I think that kind of having that big picture and realizing after you get through this, it's absolutely worth it. And I don't want to paint a picture of law school is, like this terrible process. I think there are so many wonderful things that I got out of it. And it's hard to see when you're in it. But then looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was like an incredible experience, honestly.
Absolutely. And first of all, I definitely appreciate your positive feedback about Summer Institute, which I was involved in, and my contributions to your journey. I have no doubt you'd have been fine without me, but I do appreciate it. I want to focus, Paige, on something we haven't touched on yet, but I think is also an important part of your journey, and that is the work experience that you had while in law school. You did some different things and how that led you to the position you're in now. Obviously, there's a number of years involved, but if you could maybe sort of high level talk about what your steps were on the career path to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did work in law school. I think I worked every single year of law school. And so at the beginning, I was a barista in the mornings, and that didn't necessarily contribute, except for the free coffee. That probably got me through law school. So that was critical at the beginning. But then, so I kind of had this strategy of I don't really know where I want to work. I just don't think I want to work at a firm. So my 1L summer, I worked in government and during the summer, and I worked at the California Energy Commission. My 2L year, I decided I'm going to work at a nonprofit. I worked at Earth Justice, but then I realized during the beginning of my second year of law school, I didn't want to be a barista in the mornings anymore. And I thought that it would be more useful to try to find a job at a firm because I knew it would pay, even though I was like, oh, I don't think I'm going to want to do this, but it will pay me money during law school and I will get that experience that, some places are looking for. Some places do look for law firm experience. And so I thought I could have an edge up. I didn't necessarily have to work after school in a firm, but I would still have some type of firm experience. And so I actually, my 1L summer, I was an environmental law fellow. I applied for this fellowship through the environmental law section, and I received this fellowship, and essentially it paid for my first summer, even though it was a government position that usually doesn't pay. And so I was able to get that, but with that fellowship was also the entire network of the environmental law section. And so I decided, okay, that's the first place I'm going to start to look for a job because these people know me to an extent. They've seen my application, and now I have this connection. And so I started, to put it lightly, mildly harassing a few attorneys that I knew and asking them, can I get a job? Where should I look? I asked you, and you put me in contact with someone who was wonderful, who was Orange County Coastkeeper. And she actually put me in contact with my first firm. And so it was a very small water law firm, but it was exactly what I did previously as a scientist, except it was on the legal side. And so I ended up working there after school, but also I had 2 days where I don't think I had classes, and I worked there my entire 2L year and realized I loved firm life and loved the experience that you could get from it. And then I decided my 3L year, after I was at Earth Justice, that I was going to continue working there. But also, I didn't want to just do water. I wanted to do something else. So I used my network again and asked, what do you think? Do you think I should go into land? Do you think I should go into air? And someone said, I know this firm that's looking for an associate, and you might be able to talk to them and see if they know anyone. And they hired me. And so I worked at this water law firm, and I worked at this California Environmental Quality Act, we call it CEQA law firm. And I did that for my 3L year, a lot of work, but so much experience. And that actually turned into my first job out of law school. And so I truly think that my skills, I think my skills were very useful. And I think I was hired based upon my skills and my determination. But I also do not want to leave out the fact that it was my network that got me every single job, every single door opened was my network. And so I think that is just so critical for people to understand, is that you can really use that to your advantage. And even things that you don't think are possible, or doors that are closed, they are not, as long as you use that network to your advantage.
I'm so glad you shared that point, and you combine two things, right? It's important. Absolutely, you don't get anything that you're not qualified to do, that you're not adding value. Because especially, I know at the small firm you worked at doing water law, or originally, small shops can't afford to have dead weight, right? They need people who are doing stuff. So it's absolutely true about your extraordinary skill and ability, but the networking is the sort of secret sauce to get a job, right? A lot of people can have the qualifications, maybe not as qualified as you, but they'll have qualifications, but they also have to be able to connect with the opportunity. And I just know from my experience with you that you really put yourself out there in networking. And a lot of people, Paige, as you probably know, are apprehensive about networking. They're, maybe not confident about it, or not feeling like they know how to do it. Can you share some tips about how a law student, a junior lawyer, somebody who might be apprehensive about networking can learn some from your experience and move ahead despite those fears?
Absolutely. This is one of the number one things I wanted to talk about. So I also am kind of nervous when networking. I think it's an overwhelming experience if you don't have a strategy. From my experience, that's not everybody. Some people love networking, and that's amazing. That is a wonderful quality to have, and I don't necessarily have that. So after my first conference, when I realized how overwhelming it was, and especially as a law student, coming in and, these are experts in the room and things are flying over your head, right? And so I realized I had to have a strategy. And what I did is I essentially started to, any conference that I would go to, I would reach out to the person who was on the, conference materials to reach out to. And I would ask if there was a roster. 9 times out of 10, they will provide you a roster for the conference. And so I would look and I'd say, okay, here are the 5 people that I would like to meet. And just in my head, I would highlight them. Here are the 5 people. I would know their names. I would know if they were on a panel, what panel they were on, or where they worked. And then I was just able to really focus on obviously making other connections, but not feeling overwhelmed. I already had 5 people. That was the goal. Get the business card, make the connection, and then just enjoy the conference instead of just trying to meet a million people. Right. And so that really helped to relieve the stress for me. I think that another strategy that I used that I think was useful is kind of to just have a pitch, a 3-minute pitch, an elevator pitch of yourself, your background, and what you think you want to do. Because it's not set in stone and you don't have to have, the perfect answer, but what you think you like, what you think you want to do in this career. And I think that was really helpful too, because it was kind of just from memory that I could just say something and be like, oh, yeah, so let's talk about that. Or I know somebody who's interested in that. And that was really useful. And so I think it was after my 1L summer of collecting business cards, I then started to reach out, and it was a goal of mine. And I think this is maybe an aggressive goal, but it was a goal of mine to get coffee once a week with a different attorney that I had in my kind of like the Rolodex of business cards that I had acquired. And so then I started to really solidify those foundations and keep those people in my network to this day. Right. And I know I could call them if I needed something or if I needed advice. And that is really, really useful. And yeah, I think there are a few other strategies, at least for job searching, that I have, but I think overall, at least for networking, those were the things that really helped to alleviate some of the stress for me.
Thanks for sharing that. And obviously, people can, take from it what they will and do their own thing. But my biggest takeaway from what you said was the word strategy. That, you had a strategy, a plan, and we can debate whether it was aggressive or not to plan to meet an attorney once a week. I think it's great, but the fact that you talked about with the conference, even that you tried to set a realistic goal, right? And then to give yourself the reward of being able to then enjoy the conference. And by that, it's not just interacting with people, but there's also substance, right? There's content at the conference that is important to take part in. And obviously, your story really speaks to the success of networking, because I think you said each of your jobs, each of your positions was really a result of networking, of someone connecting you with something. And it wasn't that you approached each of these people, just to clarify, you didn't approach each of these people for a job. They were people that you were talking to and approaching about your interest, your desire to secure some kind of position, and it led to job. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of times I just wanted to know how they got to where they were. Or did they start out knowing they wanted to be in private practice? Or did they start out knowing they wanted to be the head of the EPA? Just things that explain how you got to where you were so I can, see if I can use that or see if that's the route that I want to take. And so I think that was really useful and kind of just learning about their practice areas in general. And I think one of the other benefits is realizing that we're all just people, right? It's sometimes I have role models in the legal field now that I'm in it. And, they are larger than life, right? They have done so much. And sometimes it's intimidating to try to talk to some of these people. But I think you're right. I had a strategy, and I think that helped to take off some of that stress. And so then I could go in and kind of know what I was going to talk about, and then realizing, oh, they're just a person. All they want to do is talk about their grandkids with me. And I love that, and it was just really, really refreshing to realize, okay, we're all people. We're all trying to do the best we can in this profession. And I think one of the most valuable pieces that I've learned from a partner that's at the firm, he always reminds me, this is the practice of law. We are all practicing. None of us have perfected it. We are practicing law. And that always reassures me that, okay, you can make a mistake, learn from it, and we're all just human at the end of the day.
Paige, that's a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about as we wrap up here, which is advice that you have. And you've already given a lot, so I understand if you don't have more, but overall advice, particularly if we're thinking about someone who is maybe, thinking about going to law school or in law school or early in their career, and, advice that you would have, suggestions you would have, even maybe something that now that you wish you would have known back when you were, starting law school, if you can share any of that additional wisdom with us.
Yes. So I think one piece of advice that I think is really useful is knowing that even in law school, you are not alone in this. And I think I've said that a few different times, but really relying on a network and knowing there's an entire village of people behind you who are rooting for you. And sometimes you don't believe it until, you actually realize that, yes, your professors, they're all rooting for you, right? They want to help you. They are not there to, weed you out and try to get you to stop chasing your dreams. That is not the goal. And I think once you realize that, and once you see them as a tool and a resource instead of an intimidating law professor, that is so useful. And obviously that comes with, recognizing the level of respect that you have to have for your professors. They're experts in what they do, but realizing that they're not there to intimidate you and scare you. They're there to help you. And I think that is very useful. I also think that a lot of law school will help to retrain your brain on how to practice law, but I do think that a lot of the like moot court sessions, the negotiation competitions, those types of things, law review, of course, I think those are essential. And you don't have to do all of them, but pick one of them, and that will help you to give you a real life kind of lesson in how to practice law. And so I did the environmental negotiations competition. I negotiate every day, and it has proven so useful. And I also did moot court, and that I argue in court a little bit, but I think that it helped me to realize that I can stand in front of a bunch of people and I can make persuasive arguments, and my legs will not shake, my voice won't shake, and I can get through it. You know, even if my heart is beating a million beats per minute, right? I think that it's really important to kind of push yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone and see what you're capable of, because I think there will be a lot of obstacles in your way, and people even who are saying, we don't think you should do this or you can't do this. And I think knowing in your heart that you can do these things and prove them wrong is really what makes all the difference.
Paige, that's a perfect way, I think, for us to end our discussion. I'm just so grateful again that you were able to carve the time out of your schedule to talk about your journey and share your experience. There's so much for people to take away from it that can inspire them to pursue their journeys. And again, I just want to thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to following up with you at another time and getting more of an update on how the journey is progressing.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for letting me do this. And you're wonderful. And this is such a wonderful thing to do. And if anyone has questions or wants to reach out, I am available and here and happy to talk anytime. So